Today's lesson is Tipping Trends, a Global Perspective. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to talk about the concept of tipping, which is really not done here in Taiwan, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're traveling overseas, you better know about it because it is expected in certain countries, especially in North America, but in other countries as well. And we've been hearing some opinions from various people around the world regarding tipping. They were asked this question, do you tip? And they had various answers. Maria, I guess, said she tips sometimes. Javier pretty much tips all the time. And Yumi from Japan said, never. I never leave a tip. It's a social faux pas here in Japan to leave a tip for somebody.
Absolutely right. Now, in many places, it's just a polite thing to do, a social custom. If you think the service was really good, if you had a really good time, you will tip people. But in certain places, it is important to know this, especially in North America, in Canada and the U.S., restaurant servers get paid much less than normal. In many places, they have sort of a minimum pay, and no matter what job you do, you will get that money or more. But the restaurant server industry is a little bit different. I know that in Canada, they do not make the minimum pay, the minimum wage. They get about half of that or even less, but their pay will get added to by the tips. So if you're not tipping in North America, you're also sending that worker home with less money than they should really have for a hard day of work. So I would say that if you're traveling in North America, a good solid 15 to 20% tip is basically expected and polite. Only if the service is absolutely terrible should you leave no tip. And if the service is really good, you can leave an extra tip. And I'm sure that those servers will greatly appreciate it. So let's see how tipping is handled in other parts of the world. First, we're going to go to, very interesting, Egypt and China to hear about tipping culture in those places. So let's check out the first part of the article. Ahmed, Egypt. I tip whenever possible, even if it's just a little. In fact, giving to others is a core part of our religion. I can't imagine not giving a tip to someone who has rendered me a service.
In China. Very rarely. It's not the norm in China. If you leave a tip, it just causes confusion. That said, in big cities, it is becoming more common to see a service charge incorporated into the bill at a fancy restaurant.
大家好，第一部分我们来看到名词 core， 表示核心或是精髓，也可以是果核的意思。例如 The temperature of the Earth's core is estimated to be similar to that of the sun. 根据估计，地核的温度近似于太阳的温度。又或者说 After researching for 2 days, Jenny finally got to the core of the problem. 经过2天的研究， Jenny 终于找到了问题的核心。接着介绍名词 norm， 意思是常态，也可以是标准、规范或是行为准则的意思。举例来说 Treating others with respect should be the norm rather than the exception. 尊重待人应该是常态，而不是例外。又或者说 It can be challenging for people to break away from traditional social norms. 人们要摆脱传统的社会规范是有难度的。下一个看到名词 confusion，意思是困惑、不知所措或是混乱状态。例如 The passengers looked around in confusion as the train stopped in the middle of a tunnel. 当火车停在隧道中央时，乘客们困惑地环顾四周。或是 We apologize for any confusion the accidental alert message may have caused. 我们对于意外警讯可能造成的任何混乱深表歉意。再来是 incorporate 这个动词，指的是包含或是把点点点合并。例如 Tamara likes to incorporate a wide range of spices into her cooking. Tamara 喜欢在烹饪中加入多种香料。或者 The design team aimed to incorporate sustainable materials into their building. 设计团队目标是要把永续材料纳入他们的建筑中。
Okay, here's Ahmed's opinion. He's from Egypt, and he says, I tip whenever possible, even if it's just a little. So I guess in Egypt, tipping is considered a necessity when you're dining out or when you're getting some sort of service. And yes, indeed, Ahmed says, yes, I tip whenever possible. Whenever I have to, I will tip, even if it's just a little money. In fact, giving to others is a core part of our religion. So in Egypt, of course, the people there are Muslims, or they follow the Islam religion, and I guess they have this core in their religion of sharing things with other people. So it is a religious thing for them to do, to leave a tip for servers. If they don't leave a tip after a meal, perhaps it could be considered a sin.
Oh my gosh, yeah. If something is a core part of something, it's a central part, it's a very important part. In the same way that the core is the center of an apple. If you're eating an apple, it's where you find the seeds. It's right in the middle, right in the center. So if you have a core value or a core issue, it's a very important one. It's central. It's absolutely crucial. So it's a very, very important part of the Islamic religion, the Muslim religion, to tip, or to be generous, I should say. And so in a business sense or in a service sense, they express that by giving tips. And Ahmed goes on to say, I can't imagine not giving a tip to someone who has rendered me a service. Wow, so he would tip most of the people he might meet in his daily life, I suppose, especially if they render him a service. So the person bringing him his meal in a restaurant, pumping his gas in a gas station, maybe carrying his bags in a hotel, cutting his hair, driving a taxi that he's in, anything like that, where they're giving you a service, he would render a tip. To render is basically to bring, to deliver, to give over. If I have something and I render it to you, I'm giving it over to you. If you render a service, you provide a service for a customer or for someone like that. So that sounds very generous. I notice he doesn't say exactly what it is. So since it's a little, it might be, 5 or 10%. That's kind of what I'm imagining. But if I was going to Egypt, I would find out that a little more carefully, because you don't want to over or under tip. Now let's move on to China with someone named Yin.
Right. Again, the question is, do you tip? And Yin's answer is very rarely. And it goes on to say, or she goes on to say, it's not the norm in China. So here we've got an interesting word, norm. Okay, when I hear the word norm, I think of someone whose name is Normand, and norm is short for that. But in this particular case, it means the normal situation is just that term for short. It's not the norm in China. It's not something that is commonly done. They just are not a tipping culture in China as they are not in Japan and Taiwan.
All right, so it's not common in China. It's not expected. It's not the usual thing to do in China. And in fact, if you do leave a tip, it could cause a little problem. It says if you leave a tip, it just causes confusion. Okay, so I guess this is just because it's so unusual. It's so uncommon to do it. If you left some extra money, the people at the restaurant would be like, why are you leaving extra money? It was 400 renminbi and you left 500. Do you not understand numbers or something like that? They would be confused. They wouldn't understand what is going on. And that is basically a definition of confusion. When there's a lot of stuff happening and no one really knows what's going on or who's in charge or what's happening, there will be confusion. People with many questions, not a lot of answers, not a lot of leadership or guidance going on. They just don't know what the heck is happening or what is going on. This is causing confusion. People wouldn't know how to deal with it. That said, in big cities, it is becoming more common to see a service charge incorporated into the bill at a fancy restaurant. So again, kind of like in Taiwan, as people travel more, as tourists arrive more, as things cost a little bit more, in the big cities, in the more international places in China, it's becoming more common or more of the norm to see a service charge incorporated into the bill at a fancy restaurant. They will add in a 10 or 15% extra charge to your bill, so they kind of figure out the tip for you, and you don't have to do it. That service charge or that extra charge will be incorporated. Incorporated is basically included in. It's a part of something. Okay, if you eat food, you're incorporating that food into your body, I guess in a medical way. Or if there are two companies that join together and one of them kind of disappears, gets absorbed into the bigger company, that company gets incorporated into the larger company, the larger corporation. So the service charge will be added on and included into the bill at a fancy restaurant. So that saves you from doing the math. All right, we'll move on to France and the U.S. in part 2 of our little interview here with people about tipping cultures around the world.
Sophie, France. I do, but I'm in the minority. In France, a service charge is usually included in the bill, so a tip isn't necessary. But I used to work in a cafe, so I always leave a little something extra for the server.
Liam, the U.S. Always. In the U.S., it's pretty much compulsory. But it's also quite expensive. It used to be around 15 to 20%, but now it's much higher because people got used to tipping more during the COVID years. We're talking 25 to 30% in a restaurant. Honestly, I rarely eat out nowadays because it breaks the bank. I just can't afford the tip.
第二部分来看到形容词 compulsory， 意思是强制性的、强迫的或是义务的。举例来说 ，Uniforms are compulsory at our office except on casual Fridays, which happen twice a month. 除了每个月2次的休闲星期五外，在我们办公室必须穿着制服。又或者说 ，Daisy sighed when she heard that the meeting was compulsory. 当 Daisy 得知会议是强制性的，她叹了口气。最后是片语 break the bank， 表示太贵或是花太多钱。可以说 The cost of car repairs can really break the bank. 汽车修理费用可能会非常可观。
Okay, we're going to France now, and here's Sophie's opinion. Again, the question is, do you tip? And her answer is, I do, but I'm in the minority. Well, I guess don't tip in France. So if you're in the minority, you're not part of the mainstream. You don't do things like everybody else does. I do tip, yes, but everybody else pretty much doesn't tip, and that's why I'm in the minority. I'm an exception. I'm unusual. I'm not the norm.
All right, so she's one of the few people in France who does this regularly, and as we read on, we'll see she has a reason why. But she explains generally in France, a service charge is usually included in the bill, so a tip isn't necessary. Again, there's that 10 or 15% added to the bill, incorporated into your bill, so you don't have to figure anything out. A tip isn't necessary. But, and this is Sophie's personal opinion or her personal rule, but I used to work in a cafe. So I always leave a little something extra for the server. So there you go. Because of her personal experience as being a worker in a cafe before, maybe when she was younger as a student or something, she remembers those days and remembers how hard they work and how little they get paid in the end. So she always leaves a little something extra for the server. Often they'll have a tip jar right next to the cash, and you can drop in your extra euros or coins or whatever. That's always a nice thing to do, and that is what Sophie does. But again, she's in the minority in France. This is her personal choice. She tips a little bit in certain occasions. Let's move on to Liam in the U.S.
Right, he says, always, I always tip. In the U.S., it's pretty much compulsory. Okay, so pretty much just means more or less, 80%, maybe the majority of times you have to do this. It's compulsory. That just means you have to do it. You have no choice. Here in Taiwan, of course, there's compulsory military service for various males here in the society. It used to be 2 years compulsory military service, and then they shortened it, but now it's changing again. But compulsory means you have no choice. You have to do it. And yes, indeed, if you don't tip in the USA, you might cause some problems. The server may be very angry at you, and they may actually take all your food away from you after you've paid your bill, which I don't know how that's possible, but they may do something drastic like that.
Yeah, it would definitely be very, very rude to do it, and who knows, you might find yourself being made fun of on the internet as that cheap guy or those cheap tourists or whatever who don't know how to tip. So yeah, it's something you definitely should be doing. as I explained, especially in restaurants, often the servers there don't get paid the standard hourly pay rate, so they're really relying on these tips. So it's a good way to make sure that they get paid for doing good work. But as Liam explains, and as I discovered last year when I went back home to Canada, it's also quite expensive. Yeah, it seems to be going up in price, the amount of tips that people are expecting or you're expected to get. As Liam tells us, it used to be around 15 to 20%. 15 was pretty standard, 20 if the service was really good. But now it's much higher because people got used to tipping more during the COVID years. Ah, I see. So if you're eating out, or more likely, if people were delivering food to your home and you're in lockdown, you might be tipping them a little more, saying, oh, thank you for bringing this delicious food. Thank you for risking your health, traveling around and doing this and giving us something to look forward to as we're all stuck at home. And I'm saving money on so many other things, so I'm going to give you some extra money. But of course, when COVID ended, the high tips didn't go away. So as he says, we're talking 25 to 30% in a restaurant. Yeah, I think the basic lowest has gone from 15. The basic lowest is now around 20%. So if the service is really good, then you're expected to go up above that to 25 or 30% in a restaurant. Which, of course, if the meal is $100, that's now $130. So that is quite a bit of an additional charge. And then he says, honestly, I rarely eat out nowadays because it breaks the bank. I think there's a lot of people who are sharing that same opinion too.
We had that solution when we were traveling to the U.S. last time. Yeah, if you don't want to leave a tip, just take the food to go.
Oh.
Although I expect that they're going to be wise to that pretty soon, and you're probably still going to have to leave a tip even if you take the food to go. You just can't get out of leaving a tip in the USA. But here, I guess he does not encounter that problem. He does not eat out nowadays, which means in modern times, in recent times, or right now, because it breaks the bank. If something breaks the bank, it's just very, very expensive, and you'll lose a lot of money that's in your bank. Of course, this is exaggerating. He's not going to go bankrupt or anything like that, but still, if something breaks the bank, you pay a lot more money than you wanted to.
Yeah, it's way outside his normal budget. As he says, I just can't afford the tip anymore. So that's a bit of a shame for Liam. It's always nice to eat out in a great restaurant, but if it's going to mean you're eating palmian for the next month because you don't have any more money left, that is definitely a luxury you'll have to live without. All right, we have a bit more time, and we have one more person to interview. It's Chip from Canada coming up in the third and final part of our article. So let's find out what the situation with tipping is like in Canada. Chip, Canada. I tip depending on how good the service is. For good service, I'll tip 20%. If the service is bad, I still tip, but only around 10%. I think it helps encourage people to give better service.
Okay, so here's Chip's opinion. He's from Canada, which is your home turf there, Mike.
It is.
You can confirm whether he's telling the truth or not. Chip says, I tip depending on how good the service is. And that's probably the way it should be. If you get good service, you can leave a good tip. If you get bad service, you can leave little or no tip. And yes, it depends on how good the service is. Okay, so depend on something means you have these certain qualifications and they need to be met. If they're not met, then you have a certain kind of result. And if they are met, then you have another kind of result. Again, it depends on how things are done. And of course, they affect the outcome.
There you go. So for good service, he says, I'll tip 20%. Which is okay. It's a little bit low, but that's okay. For good service, they'll get 20%. If the service is bad, I still tip, but only around 10%. So he still gives a tip if the service is bad, but it will be a smaller amount, less than the expected, which is around 15 or 20. He'll give 10%, and he thinks that this is sending a message to the server. Hopefully that is true, and the server will reflect and go, ooh, wow, I got such a low tip. Did I do a good job with this customer? Did I really give them the best service I could. And if they do that and it helps them to improve in their job, then I guess that's a good thing. But that is certainly Chip's line of thought. He says, I think it helps encourage people to give better service. If they do reflect on why they got good tip one time and a bad tip another time, they might be able to figure out what they did right or what they did wrong, and then that will improve their performance as a server. As he says, it will encourage people to give better service. So there you go. I guess the other debate is, what is good service? I mean, this could be another article we look at. But like, for example, if I was in a restaurant and they were constantly coming over to my table, is everything okay? Is there anything we can get you? They might think that's good service because they're really paying attention to me. I might think it's irritating.
Yeah, you just want to be left alone to eat your meal. Leave me alone. I don't really care if you want a high tip or not. Just let me eat. And if you do let me eat by myself here, I might actually give you a bigger tip.
True.
So, Mike, did he tell the truth here? Does he share your opinion?
I think he kind of shares my opinion, but I would definitely be tipping maybe 5% higher than him in general.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's hear now from Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。在课文第一部分，我们看到一选项in的回答有一个单字 incorporate， 这个动词它表示包含，把什么合并。那我们来补充一下它的字首字根。好 corp 或是 corpor 这一类的字根表示身体、躯体或者是尸骸，也就是死掉之后留下来的骨骸。像 corpse 它是指尸体。那后来这一类的字根呢，引申表达团体的意思。我们看到在 incorporate 这个字当中，它的字首 in 表示进入，字根 corpor 表示群体，ate 是动词字尾。同学们可以试着想，进入一个团体群体就表示被纳入其中了，用这样的方式应该可以联想到 incorporate， 它表示把什么合并、使并入或是包含的意思。顺便补充一下 corporate 和 corporation 这两个单字哦。在 corporate 这个字当中，它的字根 corpor 表示团体， ate 是形容词字尾，那么合在一起 corporate 它可以用来形容公司的、法人组织的或是全体的。那如果我们把这个字尾 ate 改成名词字尾 ation， 就会变成名词 corporation， 用来表达大公司、大企业。好，在课文第二部分 F 选项是 Sophie 的回答，她有提到 But I used to work in a cafe。 然后在 G 选项 Liam 他还有提到 It used to be around 15 to 20%, but now it's much higher because people got used to tipping more during the COVID years。 好，这边我们来补充一下 used to 以及 get used to 和 be used to 的用法差异。首先used to 念快一点 used to 它表示过去经常怎么样，过去一向是怎么样，但有现在情况已不再是如此的意思。那么 used to 之后要接原形动词，例如 He used to shower twice a day，意思是他以前一天冲澡2次，这意味着他现在没有这样的习惯了。那至于 get used to 或者是 be used to， 它表示习惯于、适应于做某事，后面要接名词或动名词。那么 get used to 或者是 be used to 两者的些微差别在于 get 强调逐渐习惯于什么样的动作，那么 be 动词则是用来表达习惯于什么样的状态。我们看两个例句 He's getting used to the weather here，他逐渐习惯这里的天气了。He's used to showering at night， 他习惯晚上冲澡。那注意我们前面的例句是用到 He used to shower ... 来表达他以前冲澡的习惯。那这边是用到 He's used to showering ... 来表达他现在的冲澡习惯。好，那以上今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天单字吧。
Core。The core principles of democracy include freedom and equality for all citizens. Render. The government will render aid to those affected by the earthquake, providing them with the necessary resources and support. Norm. Carrying cash was once the norm, but in today's digital age, contactless payments have become more common. Confusion. John's sudden decision to move out caused confusion among his roommates. Incorporate. We plan to incorporate some feedback from customers in order to address their concerns. Compulsory. Education is compulsory for children in many countries around the world. Nowadays, people are increasingly concerned about various environmental problems.
Discussion starter starts now.
Here's our discussion starter, and the question is, would you prefer to live in a country where tipping is the norm? Why or why not?
I'd say yes. I think tipping is generally a good thing, considering that it can provide an incentive or a motivation for the workers to do a better job, and it allows the customer a chance to kind of give a little bit of feedback. Instead of writing a review, if I leave you a good tip, it's a good review. If I leave you a low tip, a small tip, it's a bad review. So I think generally it's not a bad thing, but it can get a little out of control when it stops people from being able to afford to go out at all.
It can be quite annoying indeed, but I'd rather live in a place where tipping isn't expected, like here in Taiwan, because I don't tip here and I do tip in the United States, and I don't see much difference between the service. The service is generally good either way, so I think it's best not to leave tips, although sometimes those servers do get paid a pretty low salary.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.